And yet, here's something that I think we need to think about. Whenever we consider these possibilities, we need to constantly be mindful of the fact that we love to scare the hell out of a film.
Warning, this is not entertainment.
Welcome to Eschaton. So we have a special treat for you guys today. I mentioned in the last episode that we would have a guest coming up, and that is today. My good buddy Dave Greenockle is returning to the podcast, and every time he's been on the show, downloads have gone up. People have loved listening to him, hearing what he has to say, great feedback, and this will be no different. For those of you who have not heard Dave before, or if you're relatively new to the podcast, Dave's a Renaissance man. He is an educator. He is the pastor at a church. He studies jiu-jitsu. He recently bought a farm and is living on a homestead now. We actually talked about that in our last conversation together last year, so I'd recommend checking that one out if you haven't heard it. But we've talked about many things together on this podcast over the last few years. We've talked about the Federal Reserve and the institution of our current monetary system. We've talked about various topics related to religion and spirituality. We've talked about farming and sustainable living. But we haven't talked about the thing that's most in his wheelhouse, ironically enough. As I mentioned, he is an educator by training. He would never say this himself, but has the reputation of being a very solid and well-liked educator. I know for a fact that he's won awards for teaching and has a very strong reputation in that field. So who better to talk to than Dave about the current state of education in America? And more pressingly, now, personally, this is kind of my little pet peeve, but, you know, with all the changes that have happened with COVID pertaining to education, I kind of wanted to get a feel, just from my own understanding, having young kids of my own, of how he sees the macro picture shaping up, lasting effects, repercussions, psychological and otherwise, on young people with the last 2 years being hybrid or being remote, having to wear masks in the classroom, all these new norms that I'm hoping, you know, won't be norms that stick around long term. But we talk a little bit about that as well. But I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation and like what he has to say about not only what he diagnoses as issues and errors with the current education system and how we got here, but also how to fix it. So hope you guys enjoy the podcast. We're going to jump right into it. It is a little bit longer, so I don't want to spend too much time on the intro. Those of you who've been listening for a while, Dave needs no introduction. For those of you who haven't, enjoy the podcast, and I'm sure you'll be looking forward to hearing from him again in the future. If you like what you hear in today's podcast, please take a moment and leave us a review in your podcasting platform of choice. It does help with the algorithm and getting more ears to the podcast. So thank you for those of you who have already done that, and enjoy the show. Dave, welcome back to Eschaton. How's it going, man?
Oh, it's going well, man. Thanks for, as always, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been too long. We been in a busy season in life. It seems like you're always busy as well with a lot of things going on. But I was telling some people recently how crazy it is to move in the winter, but getting settled in. So finally set up in the new place now and looking forward to getting back into a rhythm with the podcast. But obviously most excited to have you back on because people always love it and they tend to tune in whenever you're on to enlighten them. So in this crazy world that we're living in right now, with all the changes we've seen over the last 18 to 24 months, not just because of COVID, but just, you know, life changes and changes in the global scale as well. But, you know, for me personally, it's been a whirlwind of a couple of years. And for you, big changes in your life as well. We talked last time you were on about moving to the farm, getting some land, and kind of just a shake up in lifestyle. One of the things that's really kind of been an echoing theme, at least for me and the people that I've engaged with on this podcast, has just been how to adapt and change to quote unquote new norms in life, whether that's self-imposed through, like I said, moving out to a farm and leaving suburbia and getting into new skills and new habits and a new way of living, or maybe it's just forced adaptation. So maybe in the education system or the way that we have to change with our job and, you know, people having to figure out how to work from home, manage childcare in a different way. You have the unique position of being an educator. So you see a lot of different facets of life, for the people you engage with that most of us aren't exposed to. So your students, your peers as teachers, and colleagues, and you probably have, a little bit of that behind the curtains look at how all this, over the last couple of years has impacted people, but also before that, where there may have been, some weak links in the chain of development and education. And you had the idea a few weeks ago to say, hey, let's do a podcast on this topic of education in America, and maybe not even America, but just in the modern world. And I think that's a great idea. Obviously, you're the perfect person to talk to about it. I as curious as anybody else, to kind of pick your brain on some of the things that you've seen, some of the concerns you have, and some of the recommendations you might have to fix it. And I was thinking that maybe we could just start there with one, kind of the world that you live in at that ground level view of, what are some of the things that you've seen, and it doesn't have to be specific to COVID, but just, your background in education in general. What's the view look like being in that world? I have some thoughts on how it looks, now in the post-COVID world, but I'm thinking maybe we could start before that and maybe diagnose just, kind of the lay of the land of what it's like to be an educator in the modern education system.
Yeah, well, as we were just saying before even getting online here, education, the status of education in America in itself is an important issue, a pressing issue, and a very large issue, right? Is the reality. And the funny thing is, it's not something that like I find that like people that are not in the educational career in teaching are really talking about, right? At least that's my vibe. I talk to my colleagues about it, but I don't really talk, and I don't hear families really talking about probably the second most significant event of their kid's life. The first being like, okay, who are your parents, who are your kids, the relationship thereof. And now, you have kids that are going to be in a school for at least 13 years. Many kids are within 6 months are already going to some type of educational platform through a daycare, preschool. If you really take a step back, as an aggregate, most kids are going to be spending more time with some type of teacher or group of teachers than they do with their actual biological parents, right? I mean, I see kids, obviously different groups of kids, but as an aggregate, I was just saying, like 7 hours a day, right? I mean, how many parents see their kids 7 hours a day outside of vacation or summers or whatever? So it means it's an extremely important aspect that's going on. There are a lot of moving pieces of problems. One is the cost of education for higher learning, which is your gateway into the middle class, more or less, unless you are very skilled and very lucky to become an entrepreneur. So that's like a major facet. And then there's the facet of like, well, what is actually the intended goal in the modern era for teaching? I personally have seen that really the goal isn't, this is going to be a shocker to many of your listeners, but the underlying goal is not really to educate, in my opinion. I think it really depends on which socio-demographic you're from, but the socio-demographic that I'm teaching, which is largely upper middle class, the goal in a weird way is not really education, definitely not in a holistic approach to education. Really, the goal is, how do I get my kids to look good on paper in order to go to the best school, college possible? And so, that's an important thing to decipher as a culture. What is our actual goal in educating, right? And educating kids. I've seen pre-COVID, two things that are happening. I know teachers and nurses are notorious for complaining about their job. I don't want to necessarily go into that. I am very thankful I'm a teacher. I feel like I get paid adequately. I think my life is good. But I would say this, there has, in my opinion, in my experience, a drastic, radical shift on how communities view education, view specifically teachers, since the 2008 stock market crash. I mean, I started teaching about 2006, say 2009, 2010. It was like, whoa, a major change in how they perceive schools, how they perceive teachers, how they perceive teacher salaries, et cetera, et cetera. And I have not seen it quite recover as a culture since that point, in my opinion. So we have all that, and then of course we have the the whole vibe of technology, entertainment, competing with TikTok, competing with Instagram, competing with a generation that is so used to being stimulated, so used to being entertained, and then having to take those children and try to educate them in, in a school environment, which is, well, let's be real. It's not a real environment, right? It's not how the world really operates. So that's kind of like a broad kind of approach at how I've been seeing education flowing.
In the pre-social media world, I wanted to touch on that anyway, but to me, that's kind of foreign. I can only imagine what it's like, but you and I graduated in a time like before, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, any of that kind of stuff. I think when I graduated, MySpace was just sort of like making its way onto the scene. So
right.
It's a different world in terms of competing for your attention and then your public image. And then, I imagine things like bullying and peer pressure and all that gets taken to a whole new level with all that. But before all that, you made a comment about the stock market crash in 08 and 09 and that kind of being a pivotal point. Is that because people started to reevaluate priorities or lose faith in the system or the intent of education and finding maybe a liberal arts education to be less valuable? Or what do you think the reasons are for the shift there?
Yeah, so I would say, it's twofold. One shift was that, look, I mean, as a teacher, you're getting paid by the public treasury, right? And during really good economic times, school boards have a tendency not to necessarily say, hey, let's increase teacher salaries, right? We're at 7% inflation right now. My raise that we just orchestrated as a union was 1.75%. And healthcare costs went up 1%. So that's a 0.75%. You subtract that from 7%, 6.25. Now, look, I don't know. Maybe the business world is seeing the same thing. I don't know. I don't know.
It's universal right now, man.
Okay. So, right. So there's a piece there. But when the economy takes a tank, parents, and rightfully so. I mean, I understand it. Like, hey, I am personally getting a pay cut because the stock market has fallen. Then therefore, these teachers, are they really teaching? Do they only work 9 months a year? Blah, 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 blah. The whole kind of stereotype, right? But what I'm saying is I did not experience that kind of verbiage and that kind of community atmosphere until the stock market hit. And I would be honest, I would say probably like about a year or two until that economic recession really began to hit our community. So that was something that was going on. And so one of the things, once again, here I am a teacher, tremendously biased, but I am telling you this right now. I have seen, and I got to be careful who's going to be listening to this podcast. I am telling you, I have seen in the last couple of years, the clientele of people that are looking to become teachers is drastically lower than several years ago, like drastically lower. Like I've been on hiring committees and you're like, I'm at a very, very competitive school. Like, for example, when I applied to be a teacher 17 years ago, they literally told me there are 1,000 applicants.
Wow.
Okay. We had like 4 applicants for a recent position, right? Less kids are going into teaching. There's a teacher shortage all across the country, like significant. There's substitute teacher shortages, significant. Okay. And so that's kind of it. And obviously this is like from the teacher perspective, and I like to look at education as a form itself. But here's the thing, like, do you want your kids to be as educated as possible and have the best teachers or not? Right. It's a question you have to raise. I have seen in the last couple of years, we are not getting applicants that are the cream of the crop. No way. Right. So here's the thing, right? You can, with a master's degree or even an undergrad degree in typical professions, make you maybe significantly more than a teacher. Now, granted, teachers have, we work 9 months, we have a couple months off. I get all of that. But the frustrating piece here is if education is in fact that important for the longevity of a child and his economic output, right? Wouldn't we want to get the best and brightest of our culture and of our economy not looking to software development only, not looking to engineering only, not looking into law only, but also looking into the preparation of the next generation, right? So that's kind of like that kind of vibe. I feel like education itself has kind of lost some of its vigor in a different kind of perspective since the 2008 market crash.
I wonder how, I mean, I wonder if I assume a portion of that at least is self-inflicted just by the education model pushing business and technology and engineering and hard, scientific trades or what they call STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, like pushing those things. Most of those people aren't probably going back into the system to be educators. They're going to work for the Googles, the Facebooks, the, Amazons, and becoming computer engineers, software engineers. And nothing wrong with that, but it seems like there's an oversaturation. Like when I went to business school a few years, well, almost 10 years ago now, it seemed like there was a saturation at the time of people that were going that route, to the point where now it seems like everybody and their mother, has been told, like, go get an MBA and go work in corporate America.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm wondering if education's suffering a bit from that on one hand, and then on the other, and you can tell me if I'm completely off the rails here because you would know better than I do, but also like on-demand free learning. Like I can go on YouTube now and I can watch an actual college course beginning to end. I can actually take virtual courses through like something like University of Phoenix or Kaplan or something like that. But a lot of it's free access to information now with the modern internet. And I'm wondering, does that also kind of,
well, I think that's gonna have, I think that might have an impact in the future or near future, right? I mean, like what kid in second grade is like, hey, I want to watch, I'm gonna get my public school, I'm gonna get my education via YouTube. We're not quite there yet. We have charter schools, we have virtual schools, we have online schools, we have those types of things. But what I really think in some ways goes down, look, man, you're gonna go to college today, right? Okay, 40 grand a year.
Oh yeah.
40
at
grand
least,
a year.
At least.
So, you can walk away easy with $150,000 plus in college loan debt. All right. So you have $150,000 in college loan debt. Okay. All right. You're going to now spend that kind of money to be on a teacher's salary?
Yeah.
That makes no economic sense. Like to become a teacher, you have to invest $150,000 easy.
Yeah.
Then a master's degree, $200,000. Then take a look at the average salary of a teacher in America. 45,000, 55,000. Like you're gonna have $200,000 in loans and get a job making 50 grand a year.
Yeah.
That's not going to work. So it's economically, it doesn't quite make sense.
So the cost of education is definitely prohibitive. And I mean, and that raises the natural question, for one, is college too expensive? Should it be a free, public utility that you pay for with taxes? That's, we can have that conversation, but
it's a great conversation to have.
Yeah. Well, what do you think that actually solves anything though?
Well, this is the thing, right? I'm a card carrying member of the Libertarian Party. I'm all for like low taxes. I'm actually for private school. But the problem here is, public education is essentially created what's known as a coercive monopoly, right? There is very limited plausibility in most areas for a private school to be successful, right? They're competing against taxpayer money, right? So if you want your kid to go to a private school, you have to pay your real estate taxes, which are going into the school district, right? And then on top of that, you got to pay an additional private school price tag. So it's like almost impossible or nearly impossible to have any kind of real competition in the market, right? So that's the lot that we've been handed in terms of all that, right? But the issue and the fundamental issue here, I can't even believe I'm saying this because like I am a card carrying member of the Libertarian Party, right? Like I almost have to like turn it in for saying this, but I've kind of come to the unfortunate reality. It's this, right? Like if you want a human capital in your society to be maximized, they need to go to college, right? Like for the most part, right? But it's ridiculously expensive, right? So we were faced with this problem, 200 years ago, right? 200 years ago, roughly, what's going on here is you have a huge influx of immigrants that are coming into the country. They don't speak the language of America. They don't speak English. They're not accustomed to our holidays or cultures, the way in which we do things. So literally, there was an idea. Let's make mandatory paid for by the taxpayer, public education. Public education was not something from pretty much the year 1776 to about 1860, 1880, I believe, somewhere around there. And so what happens is a whole grandiose plan. We have all these European immigrants coming into the United States. They speak German, they speak Swedish, later on they speak Italian, all this kind of stuff. It's like you have to find a way to form them and make them Americans, right? This is legitimate. I know it sounds like right-wing conspiracy, but this is legitimately documented. We need to find a way for these immigrants to mesh with the culture of America, right? Of what it was at that point, right? So the next piece of this is like, oh my gosh, like we are moving into a second industrial revolution. We need human capital. We need people who can fulfill that job obligation. They need to be able to understand directions, be able to read, be able to do basic mathematics, and most importantly, listen to bosses, not go to the bathroom when they need to, ask permission because, if they go to the bathroom when they're on the assembly line, it's going to throw everything off. So if you actually take a look how most of your listeners went to school, it's literally and systematically designed to create habits, rituals, and skills which are needed for industrialization in factory work.
Wow.
Bell schedule, rows, don't ask questions. The answer is in the back of the book, but you're not allowed to look. Do what I say, memorize what I say, regurgitate it back on a test. Done. No free thought, none of that, right? We don't do that. We need to get you ready to be obedient factory workers. That is legitimately chronicled and true. Okay.
Yeah.
So what happens here is we realize that we need to educate our population so they could fill that job market. Okay. So we bit the bullet and we said, all right, we're going to pay taxes to do it. Got it. Fast forward 150 years. What do we need now? You need, largely speaking, people that have a college degree. You need another 4 years. So I can't even believe I'm saying this, but it's like, in some ways, I don't know how I completely feel about it economically. I think there's other solutions, but if we're playing the game that we're playing, and we're playing by these rules, which I don't think is the right game to play. I don't think it's the right rules to play, which maybe we could talk about later. But if we're going to play by these rules of tax-funded public education to get people geared up for the workplace, you absolutely 110% need to use taxpayer money in order to now, instead of K to 12, go K to 16.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying kids should get paid by the taxpayer to go to Harvard at $55,000 or $70,000 or NYU at $80,000. No, but there should be some type of 4-year state institution that's going to educate these kids because that's what we did 200 years ago. And like no one, unless you're like really hardcore libertarian or like really hardcore anarcho-capitalist or maybe some hardcore Republicans that would ever dismiss we should not fund public education K to 12. Of course not. It's a part of our ethos now, right? So if you're playing by those rules, who cares? Tack on another 4 years and have these kids be educated down the street from the high school, which is now some kind of collegiate program, to get them ready. And kids that are really wealthy, what the heck? They can go to the private schools and pay more money.
Yeah, I mean, pushback on that would be that when you get to college, it's kind of choose your own path, though. It's not the same standardized education we're all receiving K through 12. So like, where do trade schools fit into that for somebody who wants to go into the blue collar world? Might only take a year or two years to get a certification. Or what about even a liberal arts degree? You go to a 4-year school, a lot of people graduate 4-year university. And, I would say it doesn't mean you're necessarily immediately like educated. You're not, you don't really know a whole lot more than when you went in, depending on what you studied. Some people might go and they might study botany, and nothing against botany, but that's probably not going to be very applicable in today's modern economy. So if we're going to make that taxpayer funded, I think the public would want more of a say in terms of what the curriculum is, and it'd probably become more packaged and sterilized and universal, as opposed to all these unique majors. You're not going to go study art history and have your township paying for that.
Right. But it's devil's in the details always. Right. But come on, man, there are ridiculously idiotic classes in high school that is being funded by a taxpayer. Taxpayers are paying teachers to teach kids how to play dodgeball.
Yeah.
They're teaching people how to cook an egg in a pan in home ec, right? There's plenty of wasted space. I'll be the first to say, if I was king of the ship, I would completely rip out and redesign education. So that's not my like inherent idea. What I'm saying is, if we're playing by a set of rules that we've designed, this public education thing, like, it just seems natural that we would make the same decision of 150 years ago. And here's the other thing, man. I think latest stat is like 70% of those people who receive a college degree do not find a career in that said major. Like 70%.
Yeah, it's high.
Right? What do employers want to see in this job market? They want to see you have a college degree, meaning you did it, you accomplished it, you were mature enough to do it, you had the ethos and the efficiency to do it. I like that. Here's your stamp of approval. Bada bing, bada boom.
So the bachelor's degree is basically what the high school diploma was a couple generations.
100%. It's literally a BS degree. It's a BS.
Yeah.
It's a BS degree. Look, and I have a bachelor's of science, right? It is a BS degree. I'm telling you right now, I learned almost zero in college, in undergrad. Graduate school is another level. I feel like I really learned stuff. I mean, undergrad, I do not feel like I learned those things which were needed to be a teacher. I learned being a teacher when I started being a teacher. Definitely. I mean, obviously an engineer and things like that, it would be a different story, you know?
Yeah. Not to go off this path, we can come back, but I want to take it back a few levels for my own curiosity. You talked about, and you laid it out beautifully, like the modern industrial mentality that went into kind of creating a sort of indoctrination to get everybody on board for the system that we had. And you know, there's like, you know, the beige walls and the square rectangular buildings,
cinder blocks. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous.
But I'm wondering about before that. So like, what was education? I assume was primarily in the home at some point in our history, but then also, you know, you have like for the upper class or the wealthy, private tutors maybe, or just smaller settings where you hire an educator to come to you. And I'm thinking all the way back to like, you know, Aristotle being a tutor for like Alexander the Great or something like that. But that model, you know, or even like in the Renaissance era, like some of these philosophers who would actually get hired out to go educate the kids of the rich.
Yeah.
How did it work for the normal people that didn't have the money for the tutors? Did they just go get a trade at 13, 14 years old? Or how did pedagogy and education for children?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, you know, education has been a rich man's sport. You know, if you're rich, you're able to get your kind of classical education. If you're poor, you didn't. And so you became an apprentice, usually in your father's trade. And then you would learn. Now, I'm going to add fuel on the fire, but I mean, some of your listeners may hate me for saying this, but I'm a firm believer that in certain geographical areas, maybe inner city, maybe even in the suburbs, where when there is clearly a population of people for multiple reasons are not going to go to college. Okay, they're not. Either they don't have the mental capacity for it. That's a reality. They don't have the work ethic for it. That's a reality. 3, it's probably the most disheartening. And there's great documentaries and clips on YouTube about this, where kids are smart. Like they're good. Their parents don't have the money for them to go to school.
Yeah.
They're not going to go to school. What do you do with these kids? I think we're doing a major disservice, particularly amongst our poor area. We have this American dream kind of baloney idea that if they really work really hard, that they're going to be able to go to college, make something of themselves. No, they are not, period. They're not. Because when you have to take out a $40,000 a year loan, but they'll get scholarships. Fine. You take 10 grand off. They get 30,000. As a teacher, I see what kids get sometimes from scholarships. It is extremely hard. You have to be like so ridiculously athletic to get a D1 scholarship. You have to be so ridiculous academically to get an academic scholarship. There's only so much grant money and things like that. So what I would say here is, I mean, there's a conversation that they were having during the Harlem Renaissance. And it's like, look, should we really be focusing on poor kids trying to get into college, or should we be looking to educate these kids so that they can have skill sets that will allow them to have a middle-class income so that they can have a trade in order that they can have a livable wage so
Yes.
that their children can go to college. And so I think the apprenticeship trade schools should be taking like very, very seriously. Sorry, if you're not going to be going to college for any of those reasons, you have no business. You have no business studying Shakespeare.
I agree with you completely. And that's kind of what I was getting at when I was trying to talk about the history of education, knowing it was kind of divided that way. But I mean, that would never fly in today's world, because you have all these questions and arguments about class warfare and basically, creating a separate path for the wealthy who can afford it. And it's true is the hard part, because
there's no question.
It's absolutely true.
No question.
But there's no easy answer. Like, it's like somebody has to be cannon fodder for the industrial world for the system to be maintained. And nobody wants to, I guess, own that, but that's really the way the system works. We educate most of our people to basically go into a job or a profession where they have to just be obedient contributors to make the wheel keep turning around. Meanwhile, those who can afford it can go study art history, liberal arts, read Shakespeare.
Sure. Look, education is the slowest changing institution on planet Earth outside the Catholic Church. Like, it just does not change. It's ridiculous. And look, I do think that there are ways out, but I think it's going to have to happen at a kind of grassroots level. I tell my students who are upper middle class, and they think I'm nuts, but I fervently believe the answer to this is for families to think very differently about things. And it's going to take parents to really show their kids the way. I believe if you're college bound and your parents and you think you will be college bound, here's the answer. You turn 16. You get out of your sophomore year. Most schools, if not all schools, usually have a dual enrollment program with a community college. At age 16, you leave high school. You go to the community college. You take community college classes. You'll have more time on your hands, because college, you don't waste 7 hours a day sitting in a classroom. You could work part-time, you could do other things, you can work on your studies. You complete your associate's degree in 2 years. You're now 18. You have dual enrollment, which means that the associate's degree counts as your high school diploma. You get your high school degree and you get your associate's degree at the same time. You're now 18 years old, you're a high school graduate and you're a community college graduate. You now transfer to a state school. Many of the schools in the nation, what they'll do is, if you get a 3.0 or higher at the community college level, you do not need to take an SAT. You do not have to take a PSAT. You don't have to do any of that. You get a 3.0 or higher, they have agreements with state schools. They will transfer all of your credits and you get accepted automatically. And now you only have to do 2 more years. You just cut your student loan in half, and you're 20 years old and you're a college graduate. That is, like, I think, one of the major answers to this, right? And that's what I'm saying, right? Like, so now you're using taxpayer money to fuel your community college in a sense. I think you probably actually have to pay, but it's so much cheaper. Like, that's one way around it. And I think that's the type of stuff. If you have like a mass exodus of kids that are doing that, like, it will force public school to drastically change what they're doing.
Yeah, makes sense. But I wonder, is that a permanent solution or just a Band-Aid fix, though? Because the type of education, like, is there an education deficiency is what I'm getting at in terms of what we're teaching kids just to get that BS degree, that piece of paper? Or, and I'm talking about this from like a societal level in terms of like the fabric of society being able to be maintained, not just teaching people to have a job and a career, but to actually be educated. What, Thomas Jefferson's Renaissance man, like well-rounded, educated individual. Does that really matter at the end of the day, that people actually receive a well-rounded liberal arts education? Or, like you said, can you just accelerate it when you're 16, go get your associates, figure out what you want to do, and then boom, you're on your way when you're 20 and 21 years old? Is there a disservice to society by going that route and not having the social aspects that go with the education model? Or is that kind of just hyped up to be something that's not necessarily?
I mean, I personally think it's hyped up, but the economy wants it, right? I mean, look, if I'm getting heart surgery, I want the guy who's performing the surgery to have a classical medical degree, right? If I have someone representing me in the court of law, I'm going to want someone who's going to do that. Maybe an engineer, but the rest of us,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you really need that? I don't think so. I think in a utopic kind of way that what you would do is you'd kind of almost in a strange way go back to the way things were, right? And that is, hey, this kid wants to be a software analyst. Okay, he shows some promise in high school. I like him. Seems like he works hard. The company, I'm going to hire this guy as an entry level position. I'm going to train him up in computer software, and we're going to have an economic agreement. I'm going to train you, and then therefore you're entering into an agreement that you have to work for this company for 2 years, right? Almost like an apprenticeship, like in a sick way, almost like an indentured servitude, right? By doing that, I think all parties would benefit. You know, I mean, come on, man. Like, I mean, tell me something you learned from your freshman year in college. You know, it's like, come on, let's be honest, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, I think that's a way around it. Now, I don't have much experience at the collegiate level. I was an adjunct professor for a period of time, for about 2 years. And that was a trip. That was very, very bizarre. But more of my experience is in high school, right? And you know, I don't believe we're really educating kids for a 21st century market. That is a fact. Back 2007, 2008, very interesting article was published where Thomas Friedman, the famous author of The World is Flat, did a little op-ed piece on education. He talks about the flattening of the world economy, of course, how other countries are now competing with Americans. He interviews Bill Gates. Bill Gates, of all people, says that I cannot hire your kids. And he's talking about college graduates.
Right.
He says education in America is obsolete. Obsolete, right? Now, well, quite, it's not just anyone. This is Bill Gates, right? I imagine you probably hear something similar from like Elon Musk, right? They're like, the things that you are learning in school and in college are obsolete. They're outdated, right? The speed of the economy and technology is changing so quickly. You know, the things you learn in school are outdated in many regards, especially in the tech fields, by the time you get out. And so, you know, the comment here is like, honestly, you have to evaluate. If you took this seriously, which honestly, no one is. But if you were to take this seriously, you'd have to articulate what are the skills which are needed for a 21st century economy, right? And then which skills were needed for 20th century economy. There's some overlap, but there's many differences, right? You know, 21st century economy, you need someone who can speak. You need someone who can engage. You need someone who can work well with others. You need someone who understands the difference between tacit and explicit knowledge. Explicit knowledge is stuff that you get in a textbook. Tacit knowledge is I don't know the answer, but I will be able to figure it out. That's what you need.
Yeah.
You don't need someone who has memorized, you know, a definition or a date or a mathematical formula. You need people who are able to think on their feet, who have the intellectual capacity to say, I don't know the answer, sir, but I'm going to get back to you by the end of the week and I'll have that answer. And you'll go on the internet and you'll talk to people and you'll collaborate and you'll use a whole array of skills to solve a problem, right? I tell my kids this all the time in high school. I even tell the parents at back to school night. I'm like, no one is going to pay you a 6-figure salary to circle letter A, B, C, or D on a multiple choice test, right? That's not going to happen. It's not the real world. The real world is I'm hiring you and paying you 6 figures because I don't know the answer to this problem. I need you to figure out that problem. If you can't figure out that problem, you are fired.
Yeah.
So do we have kids that can figure out problems if they don't know the answer for it and if the teacher hasn't told them? Do we have kids that are able to have the maturity to be able to work in groups and to stay on task? Do we have kids that are able to find out complex problems and answer them in efficient, concise ways? You're not doing that when you're doing questions 1 through 50 odd in class and 1 to 50 even for homework. Not happening.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I work in the management consulting world for the last 7 years. I mean, that's been the industry I've been in. And it's essentially an industry. The whole entire industry is built around corporations hiring consultants to solve problems that they either don't have the funds or the resources or just the knowledge to solve. So they bring us in to solve problems. I've noticed that the majority of people that I've brushed shoulders with in the industry are either came from pretty good universities, so upper middle class, well-educated Americans, or people from overseas who came here on maybe a visa, or their parent, maybe their first generation, but disproportionately, and I'll be careful how I say it, it's not just one race, there's few, but it's definitely
Asian?
dominated by people who come from other countries. And I'm wondering what about maybe the way they perceive education or value education makes it like that, because I don't think it's just my industry. IT, technology, a lot of it's the same. Heavy population in centric in India, for example. We're actually building out resources and offshore operations in India because there's so many people that come from India. Singapore is another one. China. What's different about the way some of the Eastern models perceive education?
No, absolutely. So, there's a couple of things here. One, I just spent a couple of minutes kind of articulating some of the problems of the poverty cycle, right? Do I personally believe that there are levels of institutional racism and historical notions of that in our society? 100%, right? There's a lot of interesting sociological studies being done on the development of the suburb in the 1950s and a money vacuum that takes money out of the city, which now has less funding, which then means that there's less funding for education and police officers that helps assist in the creation of some type of poverty and poverty cycle, right? So what I'm about to say is I don't mean to degrade the realities of poor America. And that is either, it doesn't matter if you're black, it doesn't matter if you're white or tan or whatever. If you live in the poverty cycle, can you get out of it? Yes, but there are tremendous hurdles to get out. So I think if we want to take things seriously, there needs to be an evaluation of how to seriously solve that, which no politician is coming out and saying how to seriously solve it. Okay. Just throw money at it. Well, that doesn't work. Right. So I'm just saying that as a preface, because there's a certain reality here where there is large groups of people who remain uneducated. Right. And then there's other groups of people who come to America that are immigrants. And within a generation or two, their kids are college bound or they're CEOs of companies. Right. And there's a major disconnect what's going on. Right. The number one subgroup as a wage earner in the United States is an Asian male. They get paid more money on average than any other subgroup. Okay. And so a big piece of this, man, is that there are certain cultures that historically and clearly make education an absolute priority. Okay. That's why when I was a kid living in the Northeast, if you went to the doctor had a Jewish last name. And today, if my kids go to a doctor, the doctor has an Indian or a Pakistani or a Chinese last name, right?
Yeah, yep.
It's if your culture, there's something about a cultural imprint on education is significant and is important. And if your family believes that, if your community around you believes that, if your culture at large believes that, it's going to have a major impact, right? That's one. The other thing is, look, man, you're living in China, you're living in India, you see how crappy life is. You have the eye of the tiger in you, man. So from desperation, you're going to work really hard. If you live in affluence or even lower socioeconomic in the United States, and there are various ways to get by and make it, you may not be as hard pressed to make these sacrifices, right? I mean, education, like all things in life that are good, temporary sacrifice for long-term earnings, right? So I think that's a big piece of it, and I think that's why we have this change in all that. Now, the other reality is if you do the studies, both China and India, due to their very large populations, not because they're smarter, right? There's only one subgroup on planet Earth that has one deviation higher IQ as an average than other groups. There's only one subgroup. So that's a little different. But when we're comparing Americans to Indians and Chinese, particularly, right, in the age we're living in, look, they have a very large population. They have more like honors and gifted kids that are being born than we have kids.
Yeah. Well, I assume it's not biological. And that's kind of what I was getting at. Like a buddy of mine, I just went to his wedding last year. He's Pakistani. Everybody at that wedding, we worked together like 3-4 years ago. And he essentially went away. He works for a really prestigious consulting firm. Everyone at that wedding that he was related to, almost all Pakistani, doctor, lawyer, business executives. He was a management consultant at a top tier firm. And I think his resume is probably like the least impressive in that room. So, I mean, at some point you got to wonder, like, that's got to be happening in the home, right? That's got to be like instilled.
I think it's happening in the home, but I mean, I don't know how visa situations work, right? But the people that are applying for a visa, right off the bat, they have the ability to read, right? Yeah. Then America is going to invite them to come in. Okay, I don't know what the laws are, but are they like, this person has a college education, let's get them here, So I wonder how much of that is too. Like, what's your sampling? Like, which type of immigrants are coming to America from those specific areas? Like maybe their parents and grandparents were already very educated, so they already have maybe a higher IQ. Yes, that's a major thing. Do they just take automatically education more important? Or is it you move into a country and you're like, oh dear God, like what are we going to do? Oh, the only way to really get out of this mess is to, well, go forward and get educated as a solution. I don't know. Though it's very complex. I mean, I don't know if you necessarily want to get into like the socioeconomic problems of America, but there's so many things that are connected to it, man. Like it's rough. It's horrible. I mean, when you take a look at the stats of poverty and which groups are poor in America, and all of those things have like major implications.
Well, you said, if you were king for a day, you would basically gut the whole system. So like, give me some ideas. Like what type of things would you do to try to fix the way things operate now?
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple different things. One, I think that age 16 transition into community college, right, I think should become a very viable option. I think that's a major solution for at least part of the problem. So that's one thing. The second thing is, in an idyllic sense, I mean, obviously you have to have parent choice. I would never force my children to do it. But I think homeschooling is the way. That's really weird. I'm a public high school teacher. My wife used to be an elementary school teacher. I fervently believe if you have parents that are able to invest time into it, if you have kids that have the maturity as you see as they progress, homeschooling is an absolute. The amount of wasted time is horrendous in school. 30 minutes on a bus, 30 minutes home, 5 minutes in between each period changing. We're talking about like 2 hours of wasted time, at least. If you're homeschooled, you can knock out a 7-hour day in public school in probably 3 hours, if that. First 5 minutes of class for most teachers, not necessarily in my class, most teachers is just, oh, what are we doing today? Where's my papers? Where is it? There's so much wasted time. Gym class, I mean, lunch, ridiculous assemblies. So I think for efficiency of time, I think that's the way to go. I think that's idyllic. I don't think that's for everyone, but I think that's like a major thing. The other thing here is, which is very fascinating, we're talking about this going into this talk, is we do have test cases of nations who radically changed the way in which they did education and it produced radical results. Okay. So for years, the nation of Finland was like pretty dang low on educational attainment and international standards, right? And so the Finnish government was like, we're doing everything we're supposed to do. Standardized testing, we're doing what the West does, we're doing what America does. It's not producing what we need. So they said, screw it. We can't play this game. We're going to completely change what we do. Okay. And today, I was just looking up before coming on here. England is number 1 in science, number 2 in math, number 2 in literature. The only other group
England or Finland?
Finland.
Okay.
The only other country that outperforms them is South Korea, because like they're crazy. Like they like mentally abuse their kids in school. In some ways, right? So, but what's so powerful about Finland is that they were so low and then they became so high in a limited period of time. Okay. So if you take a look at what Finland did, they did some very radical things. 1, compulsory education starts at 7.
Not 5?
Not 5. Kids should not be in school at 5. They should not be at school at 6. They provide services if need be, but they are not required to go until 7. Okay. They say kids need to learn to play. Kids learn through playing. Kids should be home with parents. They should not be at school at that age, right? That's one thing. Second thing they do is they do not push all the heavy academics like we do at the early ages. They're not making sure you're reading. They're not making sure that you are doing math and all this kind of crazy stuff. Man, I got a first grader that's bringing stuff home. It's like, man, I didn't see that stuff until like 2nd grade, for crying out loud, right? She's in 1st grade. Right? What's going on, right? They say, no, the brain is not ready to receive that. It just produces stress. It doesn't create good educational habits. Kids should be going to school. They should be enjoying it. They should be socializing. They should be doing these types of things, right? And then they only go to school for 5 hours, not 7. Say 7's too long for a kid. It's not right. They have mandated play and recess for every grade level outside in Finnish winters. You go outside, you play, unscheduled play, creativity, going into the woods, going on hikes, all this kind of stuff. And then probably the most profound and drastic thing they did recently is they said, at least in some of the schools, I can't say it's for all schools, but at the high school level, they got rid of subjects.
Got rid of subjects?
Got rid of subjects.
How does that work?
It's brilliant. You begin the year with a think tank. I am going to be the coach. I have 20 kids, 25 kids. We're going to develop what our project is going to be. Now I'm like, this is all like project-based learning and all this kind of blah, 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 blah. I'm like, it's crap, right? But I started reading the studies. I was like blown away. If it's done right, because you're getting well-trained teachers and you're paying them well, and the parents believe in education, the community believes in education, big things happen. You come with a project. So here's like a kind of quintessential project. Okay, so what we're going to do this year, at the end of the year, we are going to fabricate, produce, plan an outdoor learning platform and classroom with a garden. That's what we're going to do. Okay, so, this is what we're going to do. First thing we do is we got to plan it out. How do we do it? And then when you go through the various stages, you invite other teachers in to show them how to do it and also add on to it. What do I mean by that? Okay, we got to come up with plans. Let's bring in a math teacher and an art teacher. We're going to teach you draftsmanship. We're going to teach you geometry, surface area, perimeter, angles, slope of a roof, all of that. So it's not like they build a shed. We're going to teach you geometry through building a shed. Pythagorean theorem, surface area, perimeter, measurements. And now you're going to get a woodshop teacher that's going to show you how to cut the stinking lumber. But you can't do that because you know what? You also have to go before a zoning committee. So now I'm going to teach you about law, local municipality governance. We're going to now bring in a business proposal. I'm going to teach you how to write. I'm going to bring in the English teacher, in their case, a Finnish language teacher. I'm going to teach you how to construct a business letter, how to properly address, proper use of grammar, all this kind of stuff. Now we're going to go before the zoning committee. You have to publicly speak. You have to come up with a presentation on PowerPoint. You need to show them your vision. Okay. Now we're going to build. Now we're going to do this. Oh, we're going to plant a garden. All right. We're going to bring in the biology teacher. He's going to teach you about botany. He's going to teach you about chlorophyll. He's going to teach you about all that. Oh, we need fertilizer. We bring in the chemistry teacher. Chemistry teaches you about chemical formulas. He teaches you about fertilizer, but he also fills in the backstory. You have a whole year to do this. So you're not going to just teach them about nitrogen. You're going to teach them about many things with chemistry, right? So it is education through doing, more real life type of thing. And I'm like, this is really hippy dippy, blah, blah, blah. But their statistics are not just high. I mean, number one in science, number two in the other two factors. But what's so dramatic is the pace and rate in which they saw such drastic improvement. That's the power of it.
Yeah.
So I think that's the ideal.
I assume I would expect anyway that like retention rates would be better too when you're having like real world applications for some of those things, like as opposed to sitting in a calculus class trying to remember some of these equations. You're actually doing it and putting it to use. That's actually pretty brilliant. I had no idea about that. I mean, there's some things that might not have as much applicability. Like my favorite class in school was ancient history. Like I don't know how that would fit into that type of model, but I mean, otherwise for everything like with a practical application, that sounds like an awesome idea.
Yeah, and who knows? I mean, I'm not in Finland. I haven't observed it. Maybe it's like every other day they're doing that, and on the off days they're supplementing it with. Yeah, I don't know exactly how it goes down, but it's like it's a major success story. But look, in order to do that, you need a community that buys into it. You need a community that believes in this kind of element of education. I mean, look, the world has changed dramatically in the last 10 years, let alone in the last 150. Yeah. And if you took a kid from 1880 in a city public school and you brought him to a school today, outside of the use of a computer and a PowerPoint, they would be doing the same thing.
Yeah.
It's like, come on, like the world has changed dramatically.
Yeah. You talked about homeschooling and the value of homeschooling. I mean, I send my kids to public school as well. I mean, my view on that has always been public school should be a supplement to what they're learning at home. And we're still educating them, but they're still going to public school and they're getting educated there as well, and learning things that we can't teach them just for lack of time or lack of knowledge. And you talk about the world changing. Obviously, with the last couple of years, a lot of people have been forced to become homeschooling parents, whether they like it or not. And I'm wondering, has there been any positives that you've seen come out of that? Has it been net negative on the whole, or is this hybrid model or this remote learning model, has that improved things at all? For example, time management perspective, kids not getting on the bus and going to class, they actually have more time during their day. Have you seen any of these positive shifts by having more of this time given back and kids learning in this model, or are there struggles that come with that?
Yeah, I would say two things. At least my experience around here in the Northeast of the United States, there are two options of homeschooling. It's either going to be a train wreck or it's brilliant. For it to be brilliant, you need parents that are involved.
Yeah.
It's a train wreck if a kid sits in his room and reads a textbook or does something online. There's no socialization. There's no real learning, blah, blah, blah. Homeschooling has come a very long way since you and I were kids. They have these co-op programs where kids will meet up once or twice a week. They'll get their socialization. You'll have a parent that maybe is a specialist in a certain field that will teach the mathematics, that will teach the literature, will teach whatever. They'll bring people in. The parents come together. They get a pot of money. They hire someone to come in to give advanced tutorials, things like that. There's socialization. There's enrichment. There's all of that that's happening. If you do it that way, that's brilliant. Your kids getting socialized. They're getting access to human communication. You're getting access to people that are probably more specialized than I am or any teacher is in the craft, right? That's where it's done well. Virtual learning in COVID has been horrendous, completely 110% horrendous. I would say the kids that I'm interacting with are probably 2 years behind academically in their skill set.
Wow.
I would, or maybe a year to be fair. And like 2 years or like a year and a half behind in social maturation. So, I have like 10th graders that are acting like 8th graders. Okay. I've had to confront more kids in the hallway in the first half of this school year than I have ever had to do in 17 years of teaching.
Wow.
Okay. Behavior, maturation, complete immaturity, not able to execute homework. Oh, I thought it was this, or I thought it was that, or this, that, and the other thing. But can you take this in late again? Blah, 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 blah. Like all this kind of stuff of like, that I've never, ever seen before. And then, of course, the worst of it all. Kids that are significantly withdrawn, like significantly withdrawn, like don't know how to interact, a shell. I've always had kids that are introverts. I've always had kids that are a little bit on the peripheral. It's like bad.
Yeah.
The rate of which, the amount of mental illness that I've had to deal with this year has well surpassed.
Yeah.
No, COVID is a sensitive topic. It may be a little less sensitive when it comes to kids because it seems to be statistically that children, by and large, unless they have significant immune compromised situations, if they get COVID, there's a very good chance that they're going to be just fine. In retrospect, and I would argue that there's been more harm done with putting kids and keeping them at home for so long. And this is going to be even maybe racier for people, but I know it seems insignificant, but I'm telling you, it is significant. When you have children that are wearing masks, they hide. They don't know social cues. It's weird. It's a physical barrier, but it creates this kind of psychosis of like a mental barrier. Like I'm not going to interact because I'm hidden.
It makes sense.
It's bad. It's real bad, man. I don't know what the schools are like up by you, but many down here are kids are still wearing masks. My school, it's optional at this point. Most of the kids are wearing them still. And I want to be real with you. There is a clear difference between a kid wearing a mask and not wearing a mask in a school setting and how they participate. 100%.
I believe it. Yeah. Yeah. It's not much better where I'm at. And what was it? A year and a half that was fully virtual, or was it 2 full school years?
I guess it depends. I guess it depends on the school, right? But I know my school was half a year fully virtual, just shy of half a year, and then a full year optional.
Yeah.
And the majority of kids stayed home.
Yeah.
Not because they were afraid. Some were afraid of COVID or had reasonable reasons not to. Most of them did it because you get to stay in your pajamas.
Yep.
And it's really easy to cheat.
Sure. It just makes me wonder, like, parents can't always be engaged, obviously, in those scenarios, if they're not, especially if they're not working in the house. And, a year and a half behind in social development, that's huge. Like, I read statistic a few weeks ago that I wanted to bring up in this podcast, which was that mental health for young girls, high school girls, has almost doubled since before COVID levels. So I don't want to make this about COVID, but I'm just thinking in terms of education models, like how important is the socialization factor of kids and how much of it is, I don't know, just being in that environment of structured learning. Like it's weird because there's a lot of criticism, obviously, to throw at our system, but it seems like it gets worse when people are removed from the system. So it has to be replaced with something better, which you've laid out some good options. I'm just, look,
people are like, oh, well, schools are there to educate curriculum.
Yeah.
That's a very small part, or that's one part. There's a lot of social cues. There's a lot of organization. There's a lot of culture. There's a lot of community. There's a lot of group dynamics that are very important for a functioning society. I don't teach just history. I teach all those other things too. And that's a part to play. Hence, I was saying, if you're homeschooled and you're not getting that social interaction, that's a disaster.
Yeah.
But yeah, man, no, it is. it's a crazy it's a crazy time for everyone. I mean, I can't really comment on other fields because I'm not in other fields, but
Sure.
it's been one hell of a ride, um, interacting with kids and families too. I tell you what, this is one of the most peculiar things is if you have if your oldest student or your oldest child is in high school and they're a 10th grader, which I mostly teach, that means they have not been in a real setting of school since 8th grade.
Yeah.
They're now in 10th grade. The parents themselves don't recall or understand what the protocols are. And I have found that parents have to actually be retaught of what expectations are for a high school student. The amount of emails I've gotten this year, which are trivial, which would not even be a thought 2 years ago, because they've never had a kid go through freshman year of high school and then 10th grade high school and like getting that kind of development of this is how we conduct things. This is how we do things. This is nuance. This is this is that. The parents themselves are at a loss, which
Yeah.
is very bizarre.
Do you think that there has been like a multi-generational kind of like lowering of standards in terms of child development and like the expectation of when you become a man or become a woman, for example? Like I was at Gettysburg a couple summers ago and we're reading the monuments of like the ages of all of these like brigadier generals. Some of them are like 23, 24 years old, like mature leaders of men at that age.
Right.
Now you can stay in your parents' health insurance until you're 26 years old. I mean, a lot of people graduate undergraduate, and they basically like, how to binge drink and, that's about it. I don't want to make it sound like that's the norm, but it does seem like there's a lowered expectation for development. And I see it in the professional world too, where people aren't settling down and having families at the same ages anymore. It seems to be later and later, and you're kind of just more carefree and having fun. Is that a social genesis, or is there something else maybe that you could see in the way we educate people in terms of having different expectations on development?
Yeah, I think there clearly has been, the infantilization of Americans, definitely. And there was some interesting pieces written. I think Time Magazine hit it up. Maybe it was Newsweek, where we have these like little pet names. So like back in the day, you had the helicopter parent, or the tiger mom for like the Asian mother, on top of the kid. Did you do all this? Did you do this? Did you do this right? All this kind of stuff, right? And then there's an articulation that we're actually moving from helicopter parent to lawnmower parent, which is they mow all obstacles out of the way for the child. Okay. So this is what I see, right? Any problem that may happen, the parent like immediately infuses themselves into the situation. Any kind of obstacle, they're going to like take care of it so the kid doesn't have to do it. Increase of emails from parents. How come my child got a B? How come they didn't get an A? How come this? How come that? Is there anything you do for my child to receive extra credit? I'm like, you're 16 years old. You should be approaching me about such things, not having mom or daddy do it, right? And so the question is, well, why are they doing that now? And I think part of it is, in many regards, for the good colleges, the competition to get into them has increased. There's been an added emphasis on GPA, an added emphasis on SATs. And so if you, as a parent, can mow down certain things and infuse yourself into a situation, you might be able to guarantee an increase of performance in some regards, right? And so I think that kind of is the causal effect of how higher institutions are running. And so, yeah, that comes with a cost. It comes with the cost. Your child is still a child and is going to be slower to develop. And in my opinion, is going to increase the likelihood of anxiety, depression, mental illness, because they never had to overcome an obstacle. Mommy and daddy are there to mow it down so that you can look really good on paper. And I think this is it.
Yeah.
What do we want education to be? What is actually the goal? Those are very important questions. The goal, in my opinion, right now is I don't give a crap about the true, deep education in a classical education sense of a Plato or an Aristotle or a Thomas Jefferson. It's more like the goal is to get my kid into the best college imaginable. That's the goal.
For sure.
So you have to evaluate what the goal is. And that seems to be the culture that we're in.
Equipping the kids to be the next generation of rats to run the rat race.
Yep, exactly.
It's disheartening, man, because like the idea of this nation was like farmer philosophers, right? That everybody would have a plow in one hand and poetry in the other. And it's like, we're all just absorbed by this desire for more, I don't know, greed.
Well, it's even like, it's disheartening. There's no room for poetry. Why would you study poetry? Why would you study poetry? It's not on the SAT.
Of course. Yeah. Taking a philosophy
creating
class.
Robots.
Yeah, exactly. Creating robots. And I don't know. That's a conversation for another time, but like a lot of thoughts swirling through my head lately about the value of raising my kids to go into that world. I mean, yeah, I want them to be educated. I want them to get a degree. I want them to be successful, but the definition of success has shifted so much for me in the last few years. I'm trying to, I've made it's no secret on this podcast that, my goal is to leave, the corporate world, leave the rat race behind and try to do something more fulfilling with my days. And, maybe that's farming, maybe that's doing something else with my hands. I don't know, but I've been doing the rat race thing long enough I feel confident in saying that I know it's not the answer, but yet we put all of our energy and all of our resources and our focus into grooming people to go and learn that lesson for themselves. And most of them are going to spend their lives consumed by it until they're 65.
Yeah. And I would say this in a very kind of like Hegelian dialectic manner, it's kind of interesting, this level of self-actualization that you've come to about leaving the corporate world and all this kind of stuff. How did you come to it? Probably because someone introduced you to Thoreau. Someone introduced you to Emerson. Someone introduced you to Plato and Jefferson, right? So it's weird. Like one could say, could you come to that a decision, an opinion that you have right now without your education?
Without it, I think I'm certain I would still have that like quiet desperation of knowing something's wrong, but I don't know if I'd know how to direct it.
Okay, there you go.
What direction to go. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I know changing the education system is going to be like turning around a steamliner. Like it's going to take time. But as far as like on an individual level, some of the things we can do, education has to start in the home. I think you said that earlier, and it definitely resonates with me because, I mean, again, I don't want to homeschool my kids full time because I physically think I would do them an injustice, but I do think that public school should be a supplement to what they're learning at home and not the end all be all. The parents have to be involved, whether it be my Pakistani friend I talked about or some of the people that I've worked with in the corporate world. Every single one of them that has gotten ahead, that's kind of picked themselves up by the bootstraps, pretty confident in saying that there was a strong family presence there that was pushing them on that avenue. Right. So I think that's one key takeaway for sure.
Yeah, man. Right. I personally think it's not going to change unless, like all things, I think if people opt out, like if stakeholders, parents and kids are saying, this is not good, there's got to be a different way. Yeah. And whether that's like, hey, we're leaving the public school and we're going to a charter school that runs things differently, or we're going to a Montessori school that does things really differently. Until there's democracy, man, like until there's enough of a pull and the public institution sees the data, like, oh my gosh, why are so many people leaving what we're doing? We have to change it, right? I mean, look, change can happen. I mean, but that's articulated by school boards, and school boards are democratically elected. I mean, nothing against you or anyone. It's like, when was the last time you were at a school board? When was a meeting? When was the last time you were saying, hey, I really want to implement this type of change in my kid's school? I mean, most parents don't have the time for that, and I don't blame them. I don't have the time for that either.
Yeah. Oh, it's a good point. Well, I think that's a good place to kind of bookend it, but are there any things you want to cover that I didn't touch on, or maybe just don't have the insight into, that you think are important in terms of kind of communicating the current state of where we are with education or the path forward? We didn't leave it on a really hopeful note. I know you said you don't expect much to
We're on a
change.
hopeful note. I would say this, for those parents that are listening out there from a teacher's perspective, I would say the greatest skills that stand out to me with kids is obviously interpersonal skills, carrying themselves with respect, and maturity completely stands out. Two, I would say kids that get a low grade and then have the ability to face that challenge and say, I'm going to overcome it. I honestly 100% believe that kids that get straight A's in school are not ready for the real world.
Yeah.
B students and even C students are the ones that can see adversity and see difficulty, can overcome it. I think probably in a real practical sense, I think one of the most powerful things you could do to your child is instill in them a love for reading the best you can. Some kids just don't like it, particularly males have a hard time like buying into that. But if you can really encourage casual reading and reading that the kid themselves will be interested in, reading is I see a major connection between the ability to read and the ability to perform. I had on my notes is really, I got to leave on this, man. I have to. There's a great thinker, media ecologist by the name of Neil Postman. He wrote a book called Teaching as a Subversive Activity back in 1969. But he wrote another book called Amusing Ourselves to Death.
Yeah.
He raises very, very powerful concept. And in his foreword to the book, he goes back, ironically, not ironically, but interesting enough, back to the Bible. And he says, this is the significance of ancient Israel not having gods or a god made out of an idol. Why is making an idol of your God so wrong? And so what he says here is this: the rationale, or one of the rationales, is if you have a God that is of an image, you know the image. It's very freaky. You know the thing by how it looks. Equates so much to digital media today and everything that you can see on a screen. But in ancient Israel, to know your God, you can't know him by seeing him. You can only know him by reading about him, reading his word. There's something very significant that happens there. One, in ancient times, both Jewish girls and Jewish boys all must learn to read. It's the only way to know your God. Two, to know your God through reading does something intellectually. You have to conceptualize the abstract notions of meaning by reading to understand a bigger principle. While if you see your God as a form, you know him by sight and you know only what you see. But reading forces you to take syntax, to take ideas, bring them together, to use your mind, abstract reasoning, to come up with big pictures of ideas. And that's one of the powers of reading. And I think that's what we need to instill our kids, because it does a lot.
Wow. Yeah. Well, as a lifelong B student and a lover of books, I second that.
There you go.
That was a great note to end on, man. I'll have to revisit that. I read that in college, undergrad, actually, Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. And I think he wrote End of Education too, right? Is that what that one's called?
He did.
Okay.
Yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah, it's been a long time, but I need to read it. But anyway, it's been a blast, man. I learned a ton. Happy to have this conversation. Obviously, you are an educator, so no better person to talk to. But if you want to do something again on this topic or another topic, just let me know and we'll have to make it happen.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always a good time. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, man. Talk soon.
Bye, man.
And anytime you introduce fear into a logical process, whether it's linear, spherical, or otherwise, you're going to distort things.